American Documentary Network and the Center for Asian American Media. This event will feature Mridu, Chandra, Bethany Li, and Chi-hui and moderated by Donald Young. And now I'll hand it over to Donald.
Thank you, Kia. Well, it's great to be here today. This is not, it may look like it's a conversation about Asian Americans and affirmative action, but it's in the documentary space. You know, this is really going to be about, with the striking down of affirmative action, has that set a certain kind of climate of expectations around the documentary field. I really appreciated the conversation before and hearing some of the very specific concrete steps that have been made, particularly in the narrative space. In the documentary space, it's still an uphill journey, right? So I think we're going to get into that a little bit. With the striking down of affirmative action, there's some deep concerns that the commitment to diversity might be blocked. I think there are some questions for different diverse communities of how can we begin to sort of attack this moment strategically and kind of reclaim some of the commitments to diversity and opportunities that weren't quite there, but there are some fears about whether that will be disallowed, and how can we begin to structure strategies by which we can make progress happen in a way. But I'd like to start with Mridu. You know, let's just get into this. We only have like 40 minutes, and I think we want to cover a lot of ground and hopefully set some good positive tone for today. It's just really exciting to be part of seeing the rest of the day and all the different organizations and voices that are beginning to surface and starting to claim a sort of future that those of us who have been part of this for many years want to see happen. But Mridu, you're going to be sort of the voice of filmmakers today, and it's really great because you've had very different vantage points in regards to the industry, but maybe you could speak a little bit about how, you know, when we prepped for today's call, you talked about, you know, on the one hand, when you started, you know, seeing, you know, the community. Maybe talk a little bit about when you came into documentary film, what it was like. And then, you know, this environment of the last couple of years, there were opportunities that were starting to come. Right? So, but if you could share a little bit from your perspective as a filmmaker.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm a filmmaker. I'm primarily a producer, and I've produced 12 feature documentaries and 3 fiction indie films. And I've also served on the other side as a gatekeeper and as a funder of documentary. I worked at the Tribeca Film Institute for 3 years and designed a program to fund short documentaries that also fostered them through their distribution. So that's what I'm coming to this conversation as. But I've been doing this for 20-some years. And I was just telling Chi-hui that when I moved to New York, I was actually a volunteer here at the project market at the GOSPO, it was IFP. And that was my entry, in a way, to looking at the field of documentary. It was largely white and male. You know, these were the people that I was looking for jobs from. My first project turned out to be somebody, you know, a gay man and a lesbian woman who were making a film about a civil rights activist who was also openly gay during the civil rights movement. Throughout, he was openly gay since he was in high school.
What was the name of the film?
It's called Brother Outsider, The Life of Bayard Rustin. And that was my first job. I mean, it wasn't actually my first job. That was something else on American Masters. But it was the first job that had a great importance to me because I felt I was participating in telling a story that needed to be told. And that set the stage for my career because I met people that valued that story. Our film premiered at Sundance and aired on POV in the same week, which they don't do anymore because it's very stressful. And then, you know, I met people who were making these stories that really speak to the mainstream narrative, which is largely white and largely male, as you all know. And it has changed through the years. So my career has just been very organic by finding people at project markets like this and meeting people at film festivals, and then or people find me because of the work I've done. I worked on a film called Whose Streets which is about start of the Black Lives Matters movement and the killing of Mike Brown. And I worked with them to, I'll work on a project in any capacity that I can to aid the story, because
Right.
that was a story that was not about news, it was told from citizen journalism.
Right. But you spoke to with Brother Outsider as
Yeah.
when we prepped. It was like an experience of being raised the right way, right? And you've kind of carried that approach in your film, in your trajectory as a community person, where the values of the making the film, creating community, and then, that film is as important as any film. There's a film coming out, in the award circuit of, the narrative version of Biodrustin, but it's like, it really is kind of a signifier of doing things the right way and these discoveries of community in front of and behind the camera.
Sure, so what I learned by working with Bennett Singer and Nancy Cates is because of their identity and desire to make this film and speak to the larger narrative of civil rights stories, most people on our crew are people who cared. So they would either be LGBTQ identified or people of color. And it was hard work. It wasn't like, we raised money from grants over the course of 5 years, small amounts of money, and then finally we got a public television funding and support. But so there's the story that's diverse and equitable, but then there's the team that's diverse and equitable, and that's something I learned by working with people like them from the beginning. That has pervaded my whole career.
Great. Well, next, why don't I go to Bethany? You have worked on a film, Keep Sarai Home, which is this beautiful film, but you also are the legal director of a powerhouse in the Asian American community, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. And what's powerful is that you in the context of documentary filmmakers trying to create opportunities, I think what's really going to be helpful today is to hear your vantage point of working with, in your case, Asian American communities, figuring out how, in the context of equity and opportunity and defending communities. I think your vantage point will be useful in the context of today's conversation. But maybe briefly talking about the SCOTUS decision, when Justice John Roberts said, and I think there's a kind of a pernicious kind of hypocrisy, right? Where, I'll just quote, it's particularly incongruous to suggest that a past history of segregationist policies towards blacks should be remedied at the expense of Asian American college applicants. But this problem is not limited to Asian Americans. More broadly, universities' discriminatory policies burden millions of applicants. In essence, there was an argument that we should not, that they wanted to there was a hypocrisy of supposedly wanting to defend a vision of diversity, right? And that we all who work in the space trying to create and defend progress, there's a sophistication now and a nuance of how we strategize this now that affirmative action has been struck down. I'm curious in the context of, when we prepped for this call, you talked about schools and corporations might be too timid right now. Can you talk a little bit about that? What are some of the strategies in your work that might be useful in the context of creative space? What did you mean when you said folks might be too timid or fearful at this moment? And talk about that strategy.
Sure. First? Hello? Yeah, there you go. I should first say that the decision, the SFFA decision, was terrible, and terrible, but also actually very narrow. So that kind of goes to a little bit of what you're talking about, right? Because I think the decision is being blown up and treated as the end of affirmative action. But actually it very narrowly applies to Harvard and UNC's admission processes. And so that's something that no one is really thinking about when considering what the impact of this litigation actually is. I was talking to someone the other day who was saying that he's getting really upset at all these employment lawyers advising, this corporation and this law school and whatever else, that, you need to kind of narrow this and be careful about that. And think about what it means to take the word equity out of DEI, right? Because that's actually, the word equity is actually what goes towards the structural issues that we are all fighting to improve. And the person I was talking to was saying, that's really like throwing the war before fighting the battle, right? And that is actually what I think is really important to keep in mind in thinking about what it means to be living in a post-SFFA world. It's not actually exactly the same as a post-Roe world when we're talking about what we are able to do in the context of DEI, right? So DEI programs actually are very compliant with anti-discrimination law, and to the extent that people go overboard trying to compensate for the SFFA case and setting employment policies, thinking about whether or not we should be considering about diversity in our different hiring practices, for example, that actually in and of itself, depending on what companies do, could actually be a violation of anti-discrimination law in the opposite way, right? So I think it's really important to think about the fact that there's actually a lot more that people can be doing and continue to do in promoting diversity and thinking about what it means to have inclusive spaces, but also thinking structurally about how to fix how racism has been embedded in all of our different areas, right? And we think about this as a civil rights organization in large part because when you talk about building community, that ultimately is what we're trying to do, right? Whether we're talking about fighting against deportations in the Southeast Asian community or representing low-wage workers who are suing their employers, restaurants, for example, for not paying them minimum wage, or making sure that communities, when redistricting happens, are actually kept together so that the power that can be felt from those communities is actually actualized, right? So that is actually what we're trying to do, is to make sure that our communities really belong, right? And really make sure that the structures that try to tear us apart, both in terms of an Asian American community and also interracial, right? Which is what the SFFA case was trying to do, doesn't happen.
Fundamentally, right. Well, that's a great segue to Chi-hui, Senior Program Officer at Ford Foundation, Just Films. So much of what Ford has supported recently in the documentary space is structural, right? It is making sure that there is a community for us in the context of nonfiction filmmaking. But it'd be great to hear your perspective, both in regards to what Bethany just spoke about, but also, how are you navigating, now it's a contested time. The culture wars are reemerging. We saw them in the early 90s. CAAM were a part of public media, and there's a serious fear that will get defunded in the context of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. It's complicated, contested times, yet there's this beauty to this new community of voices and organizations. So, how do we sort of navigate this space structurally of the future and what's at risk?
Yeah, thanks for having me here. And, from the perspective of a funder, say Ford is a social justice philanthropy, but also, organizations like Gotham or CAAM or Sundance, et cetera, that have programs that support filmmakers and creatives that are committed to equity, whether racial, LGBTQ, disability, and so forth. It's a really complicated time, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think, it's not because of the SCOTUS decision, literally, because as Bethany said, that it applies just to higher education. But it's more so that a lot of folks want to see if they can take that argument and make it stick to other areas, whether it's employment practices, fellowships, grants, et cetera, right? So the real concern right now is lawsuits. A lot of people are suing stuff because you gotta find the right lawsuit, and then it's gonna get elevated to the Supreme Court, and then it's gonna stick. And we're seeing that a lot within a lot of the programs that we support, that really support different filmmakers. And so when we support organizations that are advancing things, whether it's Gotham, like whether it's a mainstream white institution, like Gotham or Sundance Institute, or if it's an identity or community specific organization like Brown Girls Doc Mafia or Fireline, you have to have really good anti-discrimination legal counsel, right? Because these things, people are looking for cases to elevate. And I think what's happening is that you both have the litigation thing that's happening, and you have the culture war stuff that's happening too, as Don mentioned, right? And so, a close cousin to what's happening in affirmative action in the culture war space is cancellation, right? And so I think what's happening here is that there's a real concern that a lot of the creative spaces that we're working in are easily brought into the culture wars to really fan the flames, and that's the groundwork for changing public opinion, so that a lot of larger cases, say it's Supreme Court, land a little bit easier within the public, right? So if you can whip up a lot of concern around that white filmmakers are being canceled at the expense of filmmakers of color, et cetera, that's the groundwork for building a much larger case. And so I think that's really the concern for the creative industry right now, in a way, is to keep doing the work that you're doing, but also be very smart about it, so you don't get caught up within all this hubbub that's going on. But I also want to distinguish between the difference between affirmative action, which is, it can be very confusing and murky, and there's lots of shades in there, and that's what's happening when you try to, I guess, diversify mainstream entities that are not diverse. But at the same time, we have the idea of cultural power building, I guess I might call it, which is where you have a lot of identity-specific organizations that are creating opportunities for those communities, whether it's Frameline supporting LGBTQ filmmakers, whether it's Femme Frontera, who are supporting Latina filmmakers working on the border, and this is a very different thing, right? So one is you're trying to reshape the dominant systems. The other is that you're trying to build alternative structures that are advancing, visions of society that are equal to, and that have equity baked in, right? They need to work at the same time. One feeds into another, right? And so the thing in which we have the most power over is building new structures that support folks from the ground up. But they need to go hand in hand, obviously, with structural change within the dominant institutions. So there's a lot of stuff within there that's happening.
Yeah. Well, and then just carrying on with that, can you talk about some of the structures that are being built? Some like the opposite of the concerns over the culture wars is what is being seeded, what is growing. Like, what are you seeing in terms of the ecosystem of organizations, leadership, filmmakers, right? Like, what are the opportunities there?
Yeah, I think long term, obviously there's a lot of things that need to happen, but what we're seeing right now is, for example, we do a lot of leadership development, right? So we support a lot of diverse leaders to increase their skills so that they are on the pathway to entering into leadership positions, so that they can be gatekeepers and decision makers as well, right? So that structural change also can shift, won't always, can shift, when you have different people running stuff, right? They're making different decisions, not always. And so I think that has to happen parallel to these other actions that are happening. But I think that's the long-term shift. And obviously, within Hollywood, you have the studios, but you have things like Array, you have Macro, you have Ryback Rise. These are all POC-led, run entities that are really advancing BIPOC filmmakers, right? Which is wonderful, and and that is baked into what they do. Whether Macro will become the new Universal Studios is a different question. If it did, it would be great, but it'd probably introduce its own problems too. But then it would be a very different type of dynamic. And so, but ultimately, I think you both need to do the sort of like the the inside strategy, which is shifting the dominant structures, and then you have to do the inside out strategy, which is building new structures, which will eventually either replace those or be the center of gravity so that everyone is following a lot of the paradigms and approaches that those new entities are creating.
Right. I mean, it was striking to hear in the panel before the celebrating for, this is a discussion about nonfiction filming, but documentaries, but to hear how ahead Netflix was, I think from a documentary filmmaker perspective, that is not the case, right? So, what we've seen in the context of the documentary space is a lot of executives of color losing their opportunities, right? And so, maybe Mridu talking in the context of the filmmaker, like I could tell you there's something you want to bring up in this space, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a line we hear all the time when we watch pitches, mostly in the fiction space, but it leads to documentary, is that,
Right.
It's a film business. So you come here and you think your project about your family, from Louisiana is going to be like a story we're going to pick up. Well, if it's a good business, it will. And that,
If it's a good transaction.
Right, and so if there's no rules, I mean, why are we talking about DEI? Because that's a value. So these organizations that support films and that ask those questions, who's on your team? How are you thinking about disability access to your film after that? It's in the core application that many documentary filmmakers fill out. Will that always be there, or is that there because of this culture where we're demanding that with all these groups? Everything is interrelated, but really, it's not a requirement that we're a DEI or that we, hire people in our own communities to amplify those stories. It's a value. So if we recognize that, and then we look for we're going to find like-minded organizations, but it's up to organizations like, in the Ford Foundation application, it asks you questions about who's on your team and how are you thinking about inclusivity, and it says we care greatly about it. Not everybody cares greatly about it, and so not all funders. From my perspective, what matters is funding. For me to tell the stories I want to tell and the stories I want to support as a producer. And so
Right. It's the starting point for you.
It's a starting point.
It's the inspiration.
And we'll see now what happens at all these corporate institutions that have entered the doc space and pick up doc filmmakers and what kind of stories they pick up. Their market, they're interested in creating market awards. They want awards, they want audiences. So we have to kind of put ourselves in amplify what we can do for that if we want to get picked up by streamers. We have to speak that same language. And we can't just be like, well, I'm a underrepresented filmmaker. It has to be both. We're also providing a product.
Right. Maybe we'll go to Chi-hui and then to Bethany after. But Chi-hui, what are your thoughts about some of the intersections or opportunities? Right? I think from the context of CAAM and Asian American filmmakers, one observation I can make from our filmmaking community, it's very rare. We have a lot of distinguished Asian American filmmakers, right? And if they have the opportunity to get picked up, it's usually at the very back end of a fest. Like Asian Americans have to fully make our films on our own. We rarely get production deals ahead of time. Very few of our filmmakers have been hired to make films, so to speak, right? They're rarely commissioned, right? Like you're never commissioned as an Asian American filmmaker to tell an Asian American story. You may be fortunate enough to climb up the mountain, to get to Sundance, to make the film, and then you can get acquired after. But so what are the more structural interfaces what are sort of the next conversations that we can have in regards to production companies, collaborations, commercial, nonprofit, progressive, like what are some of the solutions that we haven't had the time to talk through yet together?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there. I mean, some of it in the short run is really thinking about different economic models and different structures for financing and building the financing for projects, so you can have lower barrier to entry, right? And so that's the big conversation right now, is new economic models for distribution really, is broken. And everyone's trying to figure it out. Everyone is trying to figure it out. So I think that's the number one thing. And it needs to be rebuilt so that it can actually include a lot more folks. So that's the $1,000,000 question. I think also it's the long game. It's structure building. We need to continue to build the talent of leadership in organizations that will continue to have a values-based approach that are going to carry that forward, right? I think that's there. And then also, and I think this is incumbent to all filmmakers and creatives who are invested in having a more just society, is that at heart what's happening here is there is a battle over narratives, right? The social narrative over zero-sum game, over there's not enough pieces in the pie for everybody, is winning, right? So if I advance, it's at your cost. I think that's deep at the heart of America, and it's one that is really being pushed. It's at the heart of affirmative action. It's at the heart of all this stuff, right? And so the more that wins, that's just going to retrench and continue to make all this work harder. The flip of it is that there's enough pie for everybody. We just need to bring everyone out. It's like there's no finite amount of pie at this table, and that's true. But that's a very difficult narrative to go against. And the other one is much easier to stick. And so if you think about embedding those types of narratives within films, within culture, so that's the way to get to social change, right? I think everyone probably here is doing what they do because they understand that culture comes before politics. And so if you can shift stuff in the cultural space and embed that in the minds of people, it's going to stick, it'll change into policy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so how, as creatives, can we deploy at the highest narrative level those kinds of ideas? And so that's long-term shifting. That's like decades shifting, but that's the long game that we need to be working on.
Wow, that's great.
Can I just add one thing about
Yeah,
what you were
please.
saying about Asian American filmmakers? We don't get picked up. I wholeheartedly agree, and I also want to add to that I don't want us to get niched into telling underrepresented stories.
Right.
Either just about our specific community, which is often a question on grant applications for a good reason, but we shouldn't get niched because we should tell the story of America and mainstream America. I want to tell baseball. I want to tell Vietnam War. I don't want to be just limited to the story that my community is from. And that's, it sounds like it's stage 2, but it has to happen all at the same time.
Absolutely, right. I mean, I'm not advocating for.
I'm just adding to what you
Yeah,
said.
no, and I think it's, and as I was preparing for this panel, what was striking to me, like back in the day when you were at Gotham, I proceed when you came into this industry, but like someone like myself or CAAM, like we would only have a voice in the context of whether or not a film could be made about our community with somebody from our community. Like literally, besides that, there was no, like that would be what we defend in the context of a funding decision, or that would be something that I could only speak to. Now I think it's shifted of this experience of going on this journey of whether one can bring a diverse story to the table is instructive, is a much more larger instructive vision, right? So I think there's a power to that gives us unique skills to navigate the future, right? So I think that's what's compelling from our sort of lens in this discussion. Bethany, I want to ask you in the context of the work that you do, like when you hear some of this in the context of filmmakers trying to find their way, like how can we get some of your, like the legal community building kind of like how can we figure out the intersections of organizational power, bringing that from the Asian American progressive community to the filmmaking space, right? Like, I'm sure this is a very different kind of sector, but like, what are your thoughts on that of like, so much of the successful work you all have done battling for communities, how can we bring that to some of our, diverse filmmaker space?
You know, the interesting thing is I think it's both a very different space and a very similar space.
Exactly.
Right? That's actually what I noticed when I was working on the documentary Keeps Her Home with
Mhm.
the filmmaker. And what I was noticing is that while we were, in the same way that lawyers are trained and taught, I'm going to say civil rights lawyers, maybe not all lawyers, are trained and taught to talk to and relate with the community, right? And be humble and drawing out stories, because that's actually what we're doing when we're trying to understand what happened in this person's life.
Right.
I was watching the filmmaker that do the exact same thing, which to me was actually fascinating,
Mhm.
right? Because I was watching him try to connect, with the families that I was introducing him to, and then having to, in some sense, connect with them on an even deeper level, because he was filming in their homes, right? Like I wasn't going into their homes, while
Right.
they were eating breakfast and
Right.
stuff. And so that was just super interesting. And actually when we were kind of exchanging some of what we knew about the different families he was filming about, it was also just really interesting to be able to hear the different perspectives, because he was also drawing out things that I wasn't drawing out, and vice versa. And so I think, the more that can happen, the better and the richer I think the stories are, and also the work that we do day to day, right? One of the things I was thinking about when you were just talking is that, we speak on different panels all the time about, for example, the effects of deportation in the Asian American community. But the most powerful responses I see when we do these panels is actually at the end of this, not when we're talking, but really when people are watching the final minutes of this film, when this Cambodian American man who had been deported comes back to the United States, and he's the first Cambodian American man who was able to return to the East Coast after separation from his family. And people just bawl every single time. They're like, oh, I forgot my tissues, right? And so that, to me, is just really impactful and a learning experience for thinking about how the work should be expressed and how to tell stories.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think following up on that, I'm sure many of the filmmakers in the documentary space would love to be considered the civil rights attorneys of, that was really a great kind of parallel versus the corporate lawyers, right? So it's interesting. Maybe before we go to Q&A from each of you, because it's Advocacy Day, like what do you, maybe at 40 you can't advocate, but what would you advocate for, Mridu? Like, in this time and moment, like what would you like to advocate for?
I think companies in the film industry should have people in power that reflect the diversity of our culture, of our country. And I think that's why people don't get picked up. People, when I read a lot about fiction filmmaking, mostly like the Sundance blog, it's just a given that you pick the next generation in terms of who looks like you. And that's why people like, the white guy at Sundance always gets picked up. It was such a hard thing to get into Sundance, and then the 3 that got bought are like white filmmakers. And that's they're extremely talented. There's also geographic diversity amongst white filmmakers I'm not really addressing, so I just want to point that out. I'm really against that. In my program, we supported filmmakers who were white males because they were from small towns in Idaho and the Midwest, and so that is another way of amplifying diversity. But I'm just talking about having people in positions of power. And just one story is like when Black Lives Matter, when George Floyd happened, and so many statements were made by companies, brands, also in the film business that I'm part of. The leaders are all white, and they're really genuine, but we need to change that.
you know, at Ford, we think a lot about like a vision of what a multiracial feminist democracy can be for everybody. And I think what I would advocate for is for everyone to understand that that is for you and that benefits everybody. It doesn't take away anything from you. And in the same way, it's like universal access benefits everybody. It doesn't just benefit disabled individuals. It helps everybody. And so I think that these are these core narratives that this country aspirationally, many people believe in, but which we need to really continue to move toward, and also illustrate and show, you know, a film that is able to visualize what that looks like and what that feels like for everybody. You know, I think it's very hard because if you know, for some folks who have a harder time seeing themselves in that, they can't see themselves in that, and therefore it is a threat. So how do you actually create a vision of that is inclusive and lifts everybody up? You know, I think that's the kind of stuff that ultimately is going to, you know, allow us to lean into, you know, these kind of commitments to justice and equity, and to create a less polarized nation. But I think it is in the hands of creatives to be able to kind of create that vision for folks to be able to see. Thank you.
I mean, I'm a civil rights attorney. There's too much to advocate for, but I think in this, I think in this particular space, what I would say is who's not at the table, and I think just really continuing to question that, right? Because we question that even within just the Asian American space, right? Like who's more dominant in that range of ethnicities? How does that work, right?
Right, there might be more challenges within our space
right, exactly.
than outside of the Asian.
Right, exactly.
Like Canada.
Yeah. And so what does that mean when we are figuring out where to put limited resources? What does that mean when we're telling stories?
Great. Well, I'd like to thank all three, but we can open up, I think. We have a little bit of time for Q&A. Do folks have questions you want to ask?
Hello, thank you guys for speaking to us today. My name is Isla and I'm from Florida. I'm sure you're probably privy to my state kind of waging a war against DEI, especially in universities like the one I just graduated from. So I was just wondering, how do you guys respond to those who don't believe in DEI or even consider it as a detriment to our society, or do you just not entertain those individuals?
Wow, great question. I'm not taking it first, but I guess I am now. I think we have to find a way together to, it's a little bit about what Chi-hui just said too, is to bring everyone into realizing and enjoying and seeing that we can't just have one story, and that having a multiplicity of stories is not threatening, it's actually additive. So maybe we need to learn, I also need to learn how to enter that conversation because I'm scared of it. And I do retreat, and my action is behind the scenes. I'm a producer. I like to support specific filmmakers, that's my choice. But maybe I need to speak out more and enter that conversation and find a way for it to not be threatening so that it can be like the dominant. It's this, I need to learn those tactics and enter that dominant space.
It's funny that you mentioned Florida because we actually are involved in litigating a case against the new Florida alien land law, which is bars Chinese nationals from purchasing property and subjects them to severe criminal penalties if they violate the law, including a third-degree felony. So, this question of like, do we engage, do we not engage? The interesting thing about this space is that a lot of people who are, a lot of Asian American people who are upset about things like the alien land laws, and it's kind of very blatant discrimination against our community, have also been against affirmative action. So it's actually fascinating and tiring and challenging and interesting navigating that space, right? Because it's hard, right? Like when we talk about this multiplicity of stories, like the nuances here are so difficult, and you know, so kind of getting in there and having conversations and really trying to understand where people are at and continuing to have those conversations, right? Because that's been true of, like, with my parents, for example, and it's taken 20 years to get them to certain places, right? So, I mean, I think it's hard to have conversation, it's hard to engage, but I think there's no other way around it, especially when I think some of the counter to this is education, right? Political consciousness raising, and that's what I think is actually how film can be so powerful.
You know, I'll just add to that. I think language matters, and I think DEI has become weaponized. Those words, they're proxies for other stuff now, and they may not be as useful just in these types of conversations. So I think it's really, it's of course to have the conversation, but maybe it's to use other words that can access people's other parts of their brains. You know, just because these are now fighting words, and they're going to elicit reactions. And so what's other language that can get in sideways? Or what's a film or a song that can get in sideways that's not going to be a head-on collision? You know, and I also think that solidarity is important for what Bethany says. You know, like, you know, at the same time that Florida was blocking a lot of African American studies, there was actually there was some work that DeSantis approved supporting Asian American studies to be mainstream within Florida curriculum. And I think that in a way, and that was advanced by a lot of Asian American communities, you know, and they saw it as a step toward a greater win, but at the same time, I was like, I want to have a t-shirt that says, we are CRT too. We're critical race theory too, because people didn't see Asian American studies as critical race theory. You know, I was like, really? Okay. You know, and that's its own dynamic too. You know, so there has to be sort of kind of solidarity there too. It's like if there's no Black studies, then there's no Asian American studies, because it's all coming from the same root. You know, it's just been weaponized in different ways or framed in different ways. And so there's a lot of that solidarity stuff. And again, it's about some of the framing and language too that has to be there.
And as well as, you know, also.
Hello?
And also,
it's demographics are such that the story, like the moral authority, the moral center is on the side of the voices being told, of the stories being told, right? So, you know, we at CAAM, part of our mission very clearly in our messaging is to the broadest audience possible. And and I'm a middle child, so you have to engage. I mean, there is an obligation and a responsibility and an opportunity. And you know, like, we first heard about this film Bad X, right? Where, you know, the numbers aren't as big, but there is a beauty to converting a conversation. And that's the challenge at hand, right? So it's not volume of change, but hopefully it's about quality of change.
This is wonderful. Thank you for just having this discussion today. I'm Najal Pham Lockwood. I am a Vietnamese American, and I am a producer, and I'm friends with many of you on the panel. You know, whether you are for or against the Supreme Court verdict on affirmative action, I think we can all agree that elite higher education is a significant pathway to success in American society. And if that pipeline is decreased for highly credentialed minority students, we're going to eventually see fewer minorities in leadership positions. And then secondly, I think the Supreme Court has sent a message that with this verdict that racism is really over in America, and that the Supreme Court is setting a new social norms for all of us to start thinking and worrying about racial diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's going to have ramifications, I think, in American companies. whether Goldman Sachs is going to end the diversity recruitment program or Warner Brothers. Are you concerned about that at all? And where are we going in terms of that moving forward at this state in our nation?
I think I would say the Supreme Court has never been and should not be the one setting the standards and the values for our country, right? I think in some sense mainstream narrative suggests that it is the Supreme Court, right? When we talk about Brown v. Board, we talk about it as this landmark decision because it was. But that decision didn't come in a vacuum, right? It actually came with all this all the stuff that's happening in society that's pushing people, right? Because the Supreme Court people are people. The Supreme Court justices are people ultimately, right? And they're kind of experiencing society in the same way that we're experiencing society. And it's actually the movements and the organizing that's happening, right, that ends up pushing the Supreme Court and other institutions the way that they go, right? And so yes, we are in a bad state with the Supreme Court right now. When we're talking about equal protection doctrine, when we're talking about equality and equity, and I mean what I just said, that's not necessarily just because of maybe a counter movement, right? But also we are kind of in a bad state in society, right? If we're thinking about it that way, and so what does it mean to be pushing against that narrative that says racism is over, that this world is colorblind, right? And yeah, I mean, I guess I can't accept that the Supreme Court gets the final say on this, and so I think part of the thinking should be how do we keep pushing against that?
I think there's a parallel to the college admissions and then also what's happening in the film space. And the answers are sort of similar too. For me, I think it would be about having admissions counselors who reflect the diversity of this country. And so, they're gonna pick a kid from their neighbor, everybody picks people and says, oh, you'll thrive in this university, I want you to come here. I mean, that's how it happens. That's how everybody gets into Harvard, because they have to go through an interview as well. So if we can enter those spaces of power and decision-making and reflect that diversity, I feel like it can open the door to different communities. And also
It will open the door.
It will open the door. And then also, people need to speak about it. And the same thing that's happening with Brown Girls Doc Mafia. We're demanding access. We want to be paid to go to film festivals because that's a barrier, so that we can meet people and get jobs, and then we can be in power, right? So all of these organizations, and I mean, in terms of academic universities, I guess we just can't sit back. We have to engage, and part of engaging is demanding it of our culture, so that influencers will start talking about it, and then it'll change the culture. And also by getting into positions of power, and also by voting.
I mean, I'm not
voting some people out.
on the point you're making. I mean, I think that also we forget sometimes that affirmative action isn't the end all and be all, right? It's a tool, but it's not the only tool. And I'm not convinced that institutions have been doing all that they should be doing when we talk about recruitment, when we talk about
we're not there yet.
right? When we talk about supporting K-12 and all that type of stuff, like what does it mean to not just be fighting over one piece of the pie? What does it mean to be broadening that pie, right? And there's a lot more things that I think many of these institutions, whether higher education or the film industry, could be doing when thinking through this question.
Chi-hui, is there anything you want to add?
Pie for everybody, that's what I say. But also, I mean, I think part of the problem is the consolidation and the centralization of resource and power. I mean, I would say that the higher education system is seriously broken. I'll say the studio system is seriously broken because they're all completely built on a total consolidation of resource and power into very few places. Higher education is totally screwed up. The economics of that don't work for anybody, right? So that's part of the problem. We need to reform higher education. We need to rethink how production happens, right? Because they're entirely exclusive. All the pressure is put on Harvard because all the resources at Harvard, therefore the credential goes everywhere. That's not the way it should be. A community college should be able to get you to where you want to be and should be able to open access and all this kind of stuff, right? So I think that's also structurally, there's major issues that need to be dealt with. But of course, the reality is, of course, if you go to an Ivy League school, you get a foot up. And so that's the present contested territory. And so I guess alongside dealing with that reality, we need to think through new structures. So what is, I mean, reimagining higher education is what we need to figure out right now too.
Okay, so we came into this conversation wanting to fix documentary. Now we're going to take on higher education and law. Well, on that note, I want to thank Mridu, Chi-hui, and Bethany. Also from BIPOC, with Nicole Chin, Sapna Sakya, and Q Brooks. Thank you all for coming today, but thank you for this, I think, beginning conversation that will continue in our community and our field, and we look forward to more. Thank you, everybody.